everything, like everything. And he invites us into that life today. And so we've been looking in the book of Acts for the past several weeks now, and I don't know if we've been putting it off or not, but there's a passage in the book of Acts that I find it quite fascinating, quite intriguing. Jasmine, do you want to put the slide up there? I often wonder why Luke, when he's writing the book of Acts, he covers off the day of Pentecost and the pouring out of the Holy Spirit in about 2 or 3 verses. You know, like there was a sound of a mighty wind, you know that bit? And there were tongues of fire that came and separated on all of them, and they spoke in other tongues, and then they went out and preached. He doesn't tell us what the experience of the receiving the Holy Spirit was like. He tells us the effect of it and the impact and the purpose for God's mission and all of it and everything. And that's what the chapter's about. 2 or 3 verses on the pouring out of the Holy Spirit, what happened in that moment. But he gives a whole chapter to a shipwreck and a storm. What is this? Did you have spare paper at the end of the story, Luke, and you had to fill it up or something? I'm not sure. But whatever the reason why we have an entire chapter given to this last journey of Paul's from Caesarea to Rome, if nothing else, it's been described as a masterpiece of vivid narrative. Like it's an eyewitness account of someone who went through this thing and tells us detail by detail what unfolded and how the whole journey happened. Another person has described it as one of the most instructive documents for the knowledge of ancient seamanship. There's nothing much else in ancient literature that gives the kind of detail about what seafaring was all about, particularly in this kind of a moment. But I wonder also if there isn't something to do with Jonah entailed in here. You know, Jonah is the famous Old Testament shipwreck. Well, wasn't quite a shipwreck. He was thrown overboard. But it was a storm, and it was a kind of a death, and it was a kind of a resurrection, and it was a call on his life to go to the city of Nineveh and to preach to them about the grace of God. Or the judgment of God and the grace of God. And I wonder if Paul isn't like the good guy against Jonah's disobedience. Paul's on mission throughout the book of Acts. That's what he's about. He's on mission. He's on purpose. He's going somewhere. He'd always wanted to go to Rome. He says in Romans chapter 15, but now that there is no more place for me to work in these regions where he was writing from, and since I have been longing for many years to visit you, I plan to do so when I go to Spain. I hope to see you, he goes on, I hope to see you while passing through and have you assist me on my journey there, that is onward to Spain. That's how you take up a collection, incidentally. After I have enjoyed your company for a while. And that's how you invite yourself to a meal. His famous appeal to Caesar in Acts chapter 25, verses 10 and 12, like Paul says, I long to come and see you in Rome, and my plan is to stop in on my way to Spain, but he could see that he was in prison in Caesarea. He had a trial in front of Felix, the governor. He had another trial in front of Festus, and Festus didn't free him. And he said, "Well, maybe the Jews, maybe they've got a point, and maybe they haven't." And Paul says, "Look, if they've got a point, I should be on trial here, and you should be able to acquit me because I've got nothing against me." And then he says these famous words, "I appeal to Caesar." Festus utters equally famous words, "You have appealed to Caesar you will go." Like there's a lot of drama in that, isn't there? You have appealed to Caesar you will go. And so that set Paul's journey to Rome. That was the way that he was going to get there. And our story picks up in chapter 27. This takes a little while to read, but it's a ripping good yarn. So, just put your seatbelts on. We're going to read chapter 27. Go. Here we are. When it was decided that we would sail for Italy, Paul and some other prisoners were handed over to a centurion named Julius, who belonged to the imperial regiment. We boarded a ship from Adramyttium, about to sail for ports along the coast of the province of Asia, and we put out to sea. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was with us. The next day we landed at Sidon, and Julius, in kindness to Paul, allowed him to go to his friends so they might provide for his needs. From there we put out to sea again and passed to the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. When we had sailed across the open sea off the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy and put us on board. We made slow headway for many days and had difficulty arriving off Cnidus. When the wind did not allow us to hold our course, we sailed to the lee of Crete, opposite Salmone. We moved along the coast with difficulty and came to a place called Fair Havens near the town of Lasea. The geography is absolutely precise, isn't it? Much time had been lost, and sailing had already become dangerous because by now it was after the Day of Atonement. So Paul warned them, "Men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo and to our own lives also." But the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and the owner of the ship. Since the harbour was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. This was a harbour in Crete facing both southwest and northwest. When a gentle south wind began to blow, they saw their opportunity. So they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. Before very long, a wind of hurricane force called the northeaster swept down from the island. The ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind, so we gave way to it and were driven along. As we passed to the lee of a small island called Cauda, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure, so the men hoisted it aboard. Then they passed ropes under the ship itself to hold it together. Because they were afraid they would run into the ground on the sandbars of Syrtis, they lowered the sea anchor and let the ship be driven along. We took such a violent battering from the storm that the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. On the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. After they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, "Men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourself this damage and loss. But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost, only the ship will be destroyed. Last night an angel of the God whose I am and whom I serve stood beside me and said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar. And God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage. For I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island.' On the 14th night, we were being driven across the Adriatic Sea when about midnight the sailors sensed they were approaching land. They took soundings and found the water was 120 feet deep. A short time later, they took soundings and found again it was 90 feet deep. Fearing that we would be dashed against the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. In an attempt to escape from the ship, the sailors let down the lifeboat into the sea, pretending they were going to lower some anchors from the bow. Then Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, 'Unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved.' So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and let it drift away. Just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. 'For the last 14 days, he said, you have been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. Now I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head.' After he said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of them all. Then he broke it and began to eat. They were all encouraged and ate food themselves. Altogether, there were 276 of us on board. When they had eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. When daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but they saw a bay with a sandy beach, where they decided to run the ship aground if they could. Cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea and at the same time untied the ropes that held the rudders. Then they hoisted the foresail to the wind and made for the beach. But the ship struck a sandbar and ran aground. And the bow stuck fast and would not move, and the stern was broken in pieces by the pounding surf. The soldiers planned to kill the prisoners to prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping. But the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life and kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. The rest were to get there on planks or on other pieces of the ship. In this way, everyone reached land safely. That was a ride, wasn't it? The journey begins in Caesarea, and perhaps there's a great picture. I've spent a lot of time in church and sermons looking at the maps in the back of my Bible. So today you don't need to do that because I've got it up on the board. But the journey begins in Caesarea, presumably where Paul had been in prison and had those 3 trials, one before Felix, one before Festus, and one before Agrippa, the king. And they boarded a coastal trader that was on its homeward journey to Adramyttium. Adramyttium is, if you follow that coast up and around, and you see the big landmass, that's Turkey, and then you follow up into the Aegean Sea, sort of around about where the N of Aegean, the final N of Aegean is. That's where Adramyttium is on that coast there, and what's now Turkey. One of the things that we kind of pass over is that in this whole story, it's got we and it's got us in it. And one of the people on the boat, we're told his name. We know the names of 4 of the passengers who were on that boat out of the 276. One was Julius, the centurion. There's Paul, obviously. Luke, who wrote the account. And then this other guy, Aristarchus. And it just says in verse 2, that Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was with us. And I paused to think about this fellow Aristarchus. And we've met him before. If you've ever read the book of Acts through in order, you get to chapter 19, and actually we come across Aristarchus in chapter 19 of the book of Acts. And here they are in Ephesus. And they've been reaching out, and they've been preaching, and they've been ministering, and so many people have turned, and they had that huge bonfire. Do you remember? I think Evan mentioned the bonfire of all the scrolls and things, and the things to do with their magic and so on, and their cult. And then this Demetrius, the silversmith, he makes little idols and images for the temple and the temple trade, and that's how he makes his living. And he's finding that the trade, like the graph on the wall of the boardroom is going this way instead of that way. We're not increasing our sales. We're losing. And he stirred up the crowd, and there was this enormous riot, and they swept into the theater of Ephesus. But as they did, they grabbed Aristarchus and they grabbed Gaius, and they took them in with them. And Paul wanted to go, and the believers said, "No, Paul, you can't go in there. They'll tear you to bits." And even officials wrote to Paul or messaged Paul, text, "Don't go, Paul." But Aristarchus was in there. Gaius was in there. And so this chap, Aristarchus, he'd been through the stuff with Paul before. And we see him again in chapter 20, and just the next chapter on, and Paul's not daunted by these things, and apparently neither is Aristarchus. Aristarchus is right there, and there's a group of them, a whole delegation. And, one of the big things that Paul was doing was to take up a collection of money from the churches that he had planted throughout Asia Minor and around there, and including Corinth and Philippi and all of those churches, to take down to the saints in Jerusalem, to the church in Jerusalem, because there'd been a famine there. And there's all sorts of reasons other than that, that Paul was doing. Aristarchus, he's one of the guys in that delegation. He's a trusted fellow traveler, a trusted co-worker of Paul. And we meet him here in this story. Like he's been at Caesarea. I don't know, maybe he's been there all the time. Maybe he's just hung out with Paul while Paul's been in prison. Maybe he was a fellow prisoner. In fact, in Colossians, Paul talks about Aristarchus. He says, Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, sends his greetings. When he writes to Philemon, he says, again, Aristarchus, this time my fellow worker, sends his greetings. He's just a name, just an incidental character. But what support and what value he was to Paul. And what courage in this man to be, swept into this theater where the crowd was going crazy and they didn't know what the outcome might be. And to put his hand up again, yeah, I'll go with you, Paul. I'm up for another journey. I'm up for another adventure. And what an adventure this turned out to be. Reminds me of that line out of the song Amazing Grace, through many dangers, toils and snares we have already come. Well, the first stage of the journey, the little horizontal line that goes up the Israeli and Syrian coast there, probably what's now Lebanon and Syria, they head to Myra with a stopover at Sidon. So that's that first little hop. Myra, you can see, is southern Turkey. They have to go around the lee of Cyprus, that is to say the north of it, because the winds were coming. I should probably do it this way, shouldn't I? The wind was coming this way, and so they sailed around the north just to get a little bit of shelter from the wind. And they made their way along that coast, arrived at Myra. At that point, the ship would take on back up to Adramyttium in the Aegean Sea, so they had to get another ship. And so the centurion found an Alexandrian ship. Now, Alexandria, of course, is Egypt. So right down there, you can see the Nile Delta, just down here, Alexandria, around about there. Egypt was a granary. They grew grain. And the ships plied from Alexandria to Rome to supply Rome with its grain. And this ship that the centurion found was one of these grain ships. It must have been quite big to take so many people on board. But that was the boat that they got. And, of course, it was going to Rome. It was planning to go to Rome, at least. So from Myra, they took off again, and they made slow progress, and they were going for Cnidus, which is just on that corner of the landmass there. It's on a real promontory. But they were unable to land, and the wind kind of just overtook. If there's wind and tide, what wins? There's a wind. The wind will always win, and so they let the wind just drive them, and they came down, and it went round the lee of Crete, away from that northwest wind. And finally, rounding the eastern point of it, got into. I'm doing this all the time because I'm looking at the TV at the back. See, because you're not looking at that, are you? Went round the lee of Crete and came to this place called Fair Havens. It was okay, but it wasn't a good place to winter in. And Paul points out that it was already, or Luke points out, it was already past the Day of Atonement. That is to say, in AD 59, which is the year that this happened, the Day of Atonement, that great feast of Israel, fell on the 5th of October, so sort of not quite... just a little ways on from now for them, but it had come into what they called the dangerous season. Shipping closed down completely in the Mediterranean over winter, so they had to find somewhere to winter. But there was this dangerous season of maybe we can, maybe we can't, maybe we should, maybe we shouldn't. And they were in that dangerous season, and Paul was definitely one for saying, too dangerous. The owner of the ship, the captain or the pilot of the ship, they were for, no, we can do this. And somehow it turned out that with a centurion on board who agreed with the captain and with the owner, there was a majority that said, yes, we will go. So a little bit of democracy there in ancient Rome. That's quite a surprising thing that I just noticed. But Paul says, I can see our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to the ship and to the cargo and our lives also. Like Paul, the great hero, Paul, the great man of faith, this is going to be a disaster. Well, who was Paul in that moment? He was a Roman citizen, a prisoner. Who's he to speak up? Oh, come on, guys, we shouldn't do this. How loud was his voice? How well listened to would he have expected to be? How would you expect to be if you were a prisoner on a ship and you said, I think this is a bad idea? Oh, shush, you're a prisoner. Did he say, but I'm an apostle? I'm a Pharisee. Well, I was. Well, actually, Paul had completed 11 sea journeys before this one and had clocked up about 5,500 kilometres of travel by ship. If you just take the 3 prior missionary journeys that he had been on, have a look at your map sometime in the back of your Bible, and you'll see there's always a map of Paul's missionary journeys in the back of your Bible. You can trace the little lines. Some assert that he was definitely the most experienced traveller on board the ship. And he himself in 2 Corinthians 11 says, oh, look, I've been through 3 shipwrecks. And I've spent a whole night and day in the open sea. Like, yeah, that's good experience. And that might qualify a guy to say, I think this is a bad idea. Anyway, it was the centurion's decision to listen to the ship's pilot and the owner and carried the majority. So there was an opportunity. Hey, this is looking good. Nice day today. Great warm south wind. Northern Hemisphere, south wind is warm. Let's make the 60-kilometre trip to Phoenix. Like, it's not that far. You can see here they were at Fairhaven. So just going 60 k's along to Phoenix here. And they had to round a little point. The wind was with them. Setting sail, they clung close to the shore, but Luke says before very long. Before very long. A typhoonic northeaster swept down from the island and caught the ship. They couldn't turn the ship. They couldn't point the bow into the wind, so they had to just let the ship be driven along before it. They passed a wee island, which you can't see in that map. It's under the red arrow. Just a tiny wee one, about 50 kilometres south of Crete, the southernmost of the Greek islands, and incidentally, interestingly, the southernmost point of Europe. But what's fascinating is as the wind takes over, as this northeaster comes and blows them, and they're out into the sea. All these things that they do, first thing they do, they secure the lifeboat, verse 16. Then they pass ropes underneath the ship so they can hold it together. The old creaking timbers get tightened up and pulled together so that just gives it that much more strength. Then they lowered the sea anchor. Some Bibles say it lowered the sails. The NIV says lowers the sea anchor, which actually does make some sense because down here above Cyrene, on the landmass of Libya here, there was the sandbars of Syrtis, which Luke references, and if the ship got driven into those sandbars, then of course they were out at sea, and that would be it. So they put down the sea anchor. Actually, I've got a slide of a sea anchor. Could you just show that? It's kind of like a parachute that goes in the water. This one's deployed over the bow, but I suspect that they stuck one out the stern of the ship and let the ship be driven along. And this sea anchor would slow the ship right down, even though the wind was furiously strong, and it would slow them down to 1 or 1.5 knots. So really, really slow. Fishermen use them to stay over. If they're catching fish, they put a sea anchor out or a drift anchor so that they can save the petrol or the diesel and the engine and so on. But for here, they're still used for times of danger and dangerous seas and so on. So they put the sea anchor out. After that, they threw the cargo overboard. Apparently not the grain, but anything else. So mum, dad, and the kids have put all their stuff in the suitcase. That's overboard. um, to lighten the ship. And then Luke says, and then they threw the ship's tackle overboard. And he adds, with their own hands. Like, that would be hard to do. Like, we need all this stuff. And over it goes. Over it goes. Well, the storm lasted for many days. In verse 20, it says, when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being lost. All human efforts had come to nothing, and as Paul had warned, they were lost to the storm. They had given up hope. I wonder if Luke and Aristarchus and maybe even Paul were included in the we of that verse when he says we finally gave up all hope. Oh, heck no. Paul's a hero. He wouldn't have given up hope. I don't know. I'm just wondering. But at that very point of hopelessness, at that very point, Paul stands up, verse 21, and he says in the lovely little sermon, you should have listened to me. He's not saying I told you so. He's just saying you should have listened to me. Keep up your courage. No one will die, but we will lose the ship. God has spoken to me, and I have to make it to Rome, and we will all survive. You notice that little divine imperative there? God, the angel said to Paul, you must stand in Rome, you stand trial in Rome before Caesar. That must carries a divine imperative. It's not just, oh, you must do this. This is a good idea. No, you must. God has said it's going to happen. God has spoken. You must stand. It's the same when Jesus went in John's gospel into Samaria, and you know the story of the woman at the well, and Jesus meets her. At the start of that story, it says, and Jesus had to go through Samaria. He didn't have to go through Samaria. Most people went round the edge, either west or east. But it said Jesus had to go through. There was a divine imperative on Jesus traveling and going through and meeting that woman and evangelizing that whole town. You have to stand trial before Caesar. And so Paul is able, in response to that word, to say, I have faith. What three wonderful words those are. I have faith. I have faith. The sea is not any calmer. There's no better hope coming. The sky has not cleared. But Paul stands up and says, I have faith because God has spoken. The God whose I am and the God whom I serve. However, we must run aground. Interesting to look at Paul's faith. In verse 10, he says the voyage will be a disaster to ship, cargo, and lives. In verse 20, we finally gave up all hope. That's facing reality. But then the God whose I am spoke to me. The bigger picture comes into view. There's always a bigger picture. And if we're going through a storm, there is always a bigger picture. And I want to remind us, and maybe that's why Luke is writing this whole story, because whatever storm we might face, whatever storm we come into, there is a bigger picture. I have faith in God that it will be as he told me. I'm remembering the times in Scripture where God has been in the dark and difficult places. David's valley of the shadow of death. Jonah's 3 days in the belly of the great fish. Joseph's time in prison. Daniel's night in the den of lions. Jesus' forsakenness on the cross. There's always a bigger picture. I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. And so here is one of the purposes, maybe the key purpose of this whole story, is to birth or to restore or to encourage faith in the God whose we are, to whom we belong and whom we serve. In the very desperate moments of our lives. It had been 14 days, 14 nights, driven before the northeaster across the Adriatic Sea, far south of Italy. And sailors sensed they were approaching land, I guess as only sailors can, with the ear to the sea and to its moods. When we're in a storm, Can we have a prophetic sense of the answer of God approaching us? We're getting closer to the answer. We're not getting further from the shore. We're getting closer to the answer. We're not nearer disaster. We're nearer deliverance. They took soundings to confirm it. They lowered 4 stern anchors, and everyone was kept on board together. They ate. And didn't you recognize in that little moment there the overtones of the fellowship meal? Paul gave thanks to God, took the bread and broke it. And they gave it to everyone. And everyone took it and they ate. They ran aground and then eventually, they lightened the ship again. This is the last thing. The bulk of the cargo surely was this grain. It was a grain ship running from Alexandria up to Rome. Surely the bulk of the cargo would have been the grain. Yet it's only now, Luke says, they threw the grain overboard. Oh, we're not going to get to Rome on this boat. This grain's not going to make it. Whatever's going to happen, we don't need it. Let's lighten the ship. The grain went overboard, the most valuable cargo of all. And they made for this little beach and they ran aground. And everyone made it safely to shore on an island they discovered was Malta. Well, they wintered over in Malta for 3 months or thereabouts and eventually took another ship to Italy. And Luke writes, with a triumph mixed with gratefulness. And so we came to Rome. They made the destination that they headed for. It wasn't the way we expected. It wasn't the way we planned. But we got there. Our lives can be like that, can't they? It's not how I planned. It's not how I intended. But we get there. I remember many, many years ago, a young man, and I was standing on an altar call. And someone came up to me and they just said, your life is going to take different twists and different turns. Much like this. But you're going to get where you want. You're going to get where you're hoping for. Now, God takes us different ways, perhaps to what we might have hoped, intended, or expected. But He's faithful. And He will get us there. He will get us there. I wonder if I could have the music team come up and Kyung Young, I can just do a change of song. Could we do What a Powerful Name? Just play that one that'd be cool. I remember a preacher once saying, I don't mind preaching about storms because everybody experiences them. And show of hands, storms of life. You may be in one right now. You might be in one. Or you may have just got through one. I won't say the other. But I have a few thoughts that I just want to share as I bring this message to perhaps an application to each of us and to our lives. Don't blame the storm. Don't blame the storm. You know, where was God when something happened or didn't happen? Why did God let something happen? If only God. Don't blame the storm. Whose fault was it that Paul got himself caught in a storm? Whose fault? Was it human error? Was it the captain of the ship? Was it the owner of the ship? Was it the centurion? Was it just one of those things that happen, force majeure, an act of God? Storms happen. It's the earth doing what the earth does, a little bit like earthquakes. Was it persecution? Was that why he was there? Was he being persecuted? Could he play the victim card? No. in a sense, all three of those things combined. Yes, there was human error. Yes, it was a natural event. Yeah, it was the Jews who got Paul arrested out of a jealousy and the persecution. But don't blame the storm. Whose fault it was, whose fault it is, doesn't really matter, and it doesn't really help. God had to have Paul testify before Caesar. The storm really wasn't the issue. The storm wasn't the issue. And as hard as it is to realize it when you're being battered, and I say that because I'm maybe just like you. It's hard to realize that when the storm is at its worst, the storm is not really the issue. Yes, it was big. Yes, it filled their horizon for 2 weeks on end with anxiety and fear and uncertainty and danger. But Paul said, the God whose I am spoke to me. He didn't blame God. He didn't blame others. He didn't blame the weather. He listened to God. Gave him courage. Gave him courage. I think courage is one of the things that we need. Parents, teach your kids courage. There are bigger things. There are bigger issues at stake in your life than passing storms. Paul, you must stand before Caesar. The witness of your life has eternal significance. The storm is only passing. Your life has eternal significance. You may not stand before the king or the government of the day. You may not be the one whose voice is the loudest like Paul's. You might be the Aristarchus. You might be the Luke. You might be the centurion. You might be anyone, but you're God's. And your life has eternal significance. You are important to God. He loves you. He has given himself for you. He has lifted you from where you were to where you are. He has a purpose and a plan for your life, and he will see it through as we yield ourselves and give ourselves to him. There are bigger issues at stake than a storm. The storm will come, and if you haven't had a storm for a while, I'm sorry to say this, but there may be one coming. Like there may be an opportunity. Oh, it's a lovely, gentle south wind about to blow. Oh, this investment is too good to be true. No, it's not too good to be true. It's a great opportunity. Opportunities come. But the opportunity is not the issue. Just like the storm is not the issue. There are bigger issues at stake with what God has purposed for your life to bring you into. Oh, the joy of living for Jesus. The joy of knowing that so we will make it to Rome. We will get where God has always said we will. And whether that's heaven or whether that's something that God has spoken to you about, being in his service on earth in this life where we are now, God will see to it. That is the bigger issue. That is the bigger thing. That is why God stands with us in the storm and says, I'm with you to bring you to where I need you to be. I wonder if you would stand with me this morning. And I just invite you to open your heart and your mind and your spirit to the Lord, because I believe He's speaking to people this morning. Thank you, Luke, for writing such a long, detailed description of a storm and a shipwreck, because in it, we see the hand of God. Are you in a storm? The hand of God is on you. The hand of God Almighty is with you. For Paul, it was his opportunity and purpose to testify before Caesar. Storms will pass. Do they batter us? Sure they do. Do they run us aground? Maybe they do. Do they cause us loss? Sometimes. But God is with us in the storm. And He's inviting you this morning to see the bigger picture. And I don't know where you're at. And I don't know what you're going through right now. But if it's a storm, if the wind has turned contrary, if circumstances have blown something up and it's just like you're facing adversity or being driven by adversity, can you prophetically hear the approaching sound of God's answer? They sensed at about midnight, in that midnight hour, in the darkness of that moment, they sensed they were approaching land. If you're in that storm, can you sense this morning? Can you open your spirit to that sense of God's prophetic word coming to you right now? Coming to you right now. The storm will pass, and you will stand secure, and I will achieve with your life what I have purposed for you. I have faith. I have faith that it will happen just as God said it would. I'd love to pray, and I just believe that maybe some people are going through storms or right now, and I just want you to come out as we sing, and we're going to sing this, the powerful name of God. If you're going through a storm, I know, I don't want to tell everybody. It's a bit like what Garth was saying before. But hey, we're friends. We're family. Why don't you just come? Why don't you just come? And I think there'll be people who can minister to you prophetically. I think there are folks who will be